Curtains have gone up for the G20 Summit in Bali as the global community faces concerns of a rampant recession, broader conflict, climate change, as well as energy and food shortages, all amid an ongoing pandemic. So are these challenges being addressed at the G20 in Bali? What are the broader implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the summit? And what essentially is the relevance of the G20 framework amid the global discord? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. The Group of 20 Summit has opened communication channels amid a host of global challenges. And for more on this, I have Professor Choi Hyun Jin from Kyung Hee University here in the studio. Professor Choi, it's a pleasure.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Kwon Soa here in the studio with us as well. Soa, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Right, Soa, let's start with you then. Let's begin with a few words on the issues being addressed at the G20 Summit over in Bali and their implications.
Sunny, recover together, recover stronger. That's the theme of the G20 Summit this year. And it is the first G20 Summit that's happening ever since most of the world has transitioned into a post-pandemic stage. The aim for joint recovery, thus, is focused on getting back on our feet from the COVID-19 impacts and addressing pressing economic challenges. The latter one, of course, being a usual purpose of the G20, which focuses on the global economy. And with a potential economic recession lurking around the corner, the challenges seem to be extremely daunting this time around. So the Indonesian G20 presidency's official agenda is broken down into three parts. First, strengthening of global health architecture so that we can get more ready for future crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And the second one is digital transformation. Enhanced digital skills and digital literacy will be discussed, especially in the education sector. And the third is sustainable energy transition, which means to promote a transition to cleaner energy sources to confront maybe which is the most imminent task in the world, climate change. So this broadly lays out the issues to be dealt with, which, however, largely are expected to be overshadowed by geopolitical tensions. Bearing this in mind, Indonesian President Joko Widodo said ahead of the event, the G20 is not meant to be a political forum, it's meant to be about economics and development.
Right, and talking about geopolitical concerns, Professor Choi, it does come amid, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that being said, how do you interpret Vladimir Putin's decision to skip this particular summit?
I think the reason is simple and very straightforward. From Putin's perspective, there is nothing to gain and much to lose from the Bali summit. The G20 is a group of the world's most powerful nations. They account for more than 80% of the global production. And Western leaders, including Joe Biden, they were expected to use this forum to openly slam Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And that would be a huge embarrassment if Putin actually attended this meeting. And I believe Putin does not really want to broadcast this scene of condemnation to the domestic Russian media.
Right, I see. And staying with that, so this is perhaps why I understand the G20 family photo session may be scrapped. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular decision and what essentially does this tell us about unity within the G20 framework?
Right, Sunny, the G20 leaders are highly likely to skip the photo session in strong objection against Russia because someone would have to stand shoulder to shoulder with Russia, even if it's not Putin himself, but Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, because the presence of Russia itself is what's disturbing to many of the leaders. So some might think it shouldn't be a big deal to just not have a photo at the meeting, but this so-called family photo is a tradition and displays unity within the G20. And that means there's no 20-member unity at this point. Also, the short occasion while rubbing shoulders with each other can actually turn into symbolic kind of moments that are caught on camera, which can show who's kind of friendly with whom and who's standing against next to each other and in which row. So all of these small talks happening there can also be very meaningful. And it's actually been a while that we've seen these members close to each other, because last year there were some members missing because of COVID-19, and even the other members during the photo session had to, distance themselves from others because of the virus.
Right, a good point right there. Professor Choi, pundits also claim that a joint statement signed by all members of the G20 is unlikely as well. Do you agree? And if so, what does this tell us about the relevance of the G20?
I partly agree. Russia divided the G20 members over the war in Ukraine and also each perpetrator and how the war should end. And for example, China and India, they have not condemned Putin and also its annexation of the eastern part of Ukraine. And also other members of G20, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. And they have turned down Western demands to sanction Russia for its invasion. And therefore, it is not easy or very difficult to agree on language condemning Russian invasion of Ukraine. But still, there is some possibility. But I think if G20 members ever reaches an agreement, I think it would be a broad and non-specific statement, such as not a good time for war or no use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And also, as for your second comment on the relevance of a G20, we need to remember that the G20 began in 2008 by George W. Bush's demand to coordinate the global response to global financial crisis. And there have been some important achievements since then. For example, at the second meeting in 2009, the G20 agreed to collectively spend $5 trillion to boost the global economy and also provide additional $1.1 trillion for the International Monetary Fund, IMF. And even if G20 fails to agree on some political issues such as war in Ukraine, I hope they may produce some action plan to address global inflation and food and energy shortage problem and rising debt problem in the developing world.
Right, I'm sure many are hoping for that as well. Yeah. Moving forward, so ahead of the G20 summit, Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping met on Monday evening for a very high-profile interaction since Mr. Biden entered the White House. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Right, it was the first one since Biden took office and also the first one since Xi secured his third term in office. So it was a 3-hour talk that was held between the two leaders. So let me give you first a general feel of the talk. It looks like the two leaders were open and straightforward towards each other, expressed their respective interests, but were nowhere near resolving any of the wide range of issues that Washington and Beijing disagree with each other. But fears of a new Cold War seemed to have cooled. Biden also said that he doesn't think there is an imminent attempt by China to invade Taiwan. Now, the Taiwan issue, however, was a point that Biden made, according to the White House, which said he laid out in detail that the one China policy has not changed and that the world has an interest in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. leader also raised concerns over China's human rights issues, while China defended what it calls the Chinese-style democracy. Regarding Taiwan, the Chinese Foreign Ministry cited Xi as stating Taiwan is the first red line that must not be crossed in China-U.S. ties. What Xi and Biden seem to be on the same page on was that a nuclear war should not be fought and cannot be won in regards to threats of nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. And one topic that's in particular interest for us here in South Korea is North Korea, of course, an area the two countries cooperate more in. Biden said he called on his counterpart to dissuade North Korea from using nuclear weapons, but added that it's difficult to kind of determine whether Beijing has the capacity in convincing North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
Right, and speaking about North Korea, I suppose that will also be on the agenda between talks between President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping later on this Tuesday.
Right, that's set to happen at 5 p.m. local time. That will be 6 p.m. here in Korea. It was not before this Tuesday morning that the presidential office revealed that there's going to be an official meeting between Yoon and Xi. So different from earlier when we expected that it's going to be a kind of natural encounter. So with that, President Yoon will have had one-on-ones with his counterparts from the U.S., Japan, and China now, and which are all the three key players evolving around the North Korea issue. So speaking of which, North Korea's missile and nuclear threats are expected to be one of the main agenda when President Yoon speaks with his Chinese counterpart. So similar to Biden, Yoon may ask for more cooperation from China, and with that also side with Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, which just recently have agreed to jointly respond if North Korea conducts a next nuclear test.
Right, and beyond security concerns here on the Korean Peninsula, Professor Choi, earlier on Monday, President Yoon Suk-yeol addressed the B20 gathering ahead of the G20, of course, which began today. Do tell us a bit about the B20 gathering and also about the gist of President Yoon's address to this particular gathering.
The so-called the B20, B20 stands for Business 20. It was established in 2010 on the sideline of the G20 Summit to channel the voice and demand of the global business community to G20 leaders. And President Yoon delivered a keynote speech on this Monday before the representative of numerous companies from 20 major countries. And the world is now divided over the cause and the solution to the global economic crisis. And the West argues that this crisis was caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the Russia argues that it was caused by Western economic sanctions on Russia. So the world has a very different opinion. But in the middle of this divide, the President Yoon suggested an alternative solution to the global complex crisis, and that was the digital transformation in the private sector. And he emphasized that this crisis can be overcome when new business with the digital and big data technology are constantly emerging to reduce production costs and create new value. And that was the gist of his speech.
Right, I see. And beyond Korea's interests then, saw British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who both entered office in late October at the G20 Summit. Could you briefly tell us a bit about their agendas there?
Sure. So these are the two latest newcomers. So starting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he's expected to have a strong message to Russia and Putin. He told reporters after arriving in Bali on how he would approach Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who'll be there on behalf of Vladimir Putin, of course, that he's going to use the opportunity to, quote, unequivocally condemn Russia's hostile and illegal war in Ukraine, adding he's confident about other allies doing the same. And the more official agenda of the new British Prime Minister includes a call for coordinated global action to tackle international economic instability and the rising cost of living. And as part of that, he's going to unveil a 5-point economic action plan. And he's also going to have some summit meetings, including with U.S. President Joe Biden. Now, for Italy's first woman Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, the most anticipated one-on-one is also going to be with Biden. And she's expected to discuss with him cooperation on shared global challenges, including the threats posed by China and ongoing efforts to help Ukraine defend itself from Russian aggression. She's also going to meet with her Chinese and Indian prime minister counterparts, that is, but no summit is scheduled with Emmanuel Macron, the French prime minister, because Italy and France's ties are soured over a migrant boat issue.
Right. Professor Choi, simply speaking, do you suppose this latest G20 summit will serve to perhaps merely showcase the divisions that plague the international community, or could it serve perhaps to create a bridge across these divisions to address pending universal concerns, very briefly speaking?
That's a very challenging question, and frankly, I think both of them are possible. The first G20 meeting was held in 2008, but now in 2020, we are living in a very different world. We are back in a world politics where geopolitical rivalry between the West and Russia is present once again, and now this rivalry is extending to China as well. And as a result, the ability of the G20 to coordinate actions to coping with the complex crisis is very much limited. But I think there's still a hope in this meeting. This year's G20 can make some concrete action plan for climate change, pandemic, and global energy prices.
And hopefully you are right, Professor Choi. And thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And so thank you very much for your insights.
Anytime.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. We'll be back tomorrow, same time. Thank you for watching.